Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Blind Spot. And apart from Evan and Adam, today we have an amazing guest, Mary-Jane Rubenstein. I'm super happy that she's here. She made sure that I didn't say Rubenstein when she introduced herself. She said, it rhymes with Frankenstein. I'm like, okay, that's good to know. And she's the Dean of Social Sciences at Wesleyan University, where she's also professor of religion, philosophy, and science and technology studies. She writes about the ways in which religion and science shape one another, and most recently in an edited volume called Sacred Skies, Religion and Space Exploration. And then a 22 book called Astrotopia, the dangerous religion of corporate space race. And so Mary Jane talks about all sorts of different things, but always with a band on, I think, you correct me, okay, MJ, if I'm wrong, on science clashing with religion in kind of disconcerting ways, perhaps, that maybe help us understand the current cultural moment, so to speak. So welcome, Mary Jane. Thanks for joining us, really.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcelo. I'm so glad to be here. And hi, Evan, and hi, Adam.
Hey, great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I want to start from, not all the way from the back, but I want to start from the book that I got to know you from, which is The Worlds Without End, the book about the multiverse. So it's a book that is from, I think, 2014, maybe. And it's a book about the idea of the multiverse across philosophy and the sciences, right? So that was a while back. So that was 11 years ago. And are you still revisiting this conversation? Because I remember you sent me an email some time ago talking about that concern, what is the multiverse in the sense of, is it really science or not? And so how do you see these things nowadays?
That's great. Yeah, I did just write an essay for Stephen J. Dick, who's one of the former chief historians at NASA. He's editing a volume on astronomy and philosophy and asked if I would contribute an essay addressing the question, is the multiverse scientific? Right? Is it a scientific principle? And so, Marcelo, yes, I think I checked in with you to say, have you written anything recently on the, because I had to sort of brush off my sources, dust them off, and come back around to them. So the multiverse, just for anybody who may not be up on it at the moment, it's this hypothetical notion that the universe in which we live might be just one of an infinite number of either connected or disconnected universes generated throughout infinite space and time. And as it turns out, this history has a very long idea. In the sort of European descending world, it traces back at least 2,500 years to the ancient Greeks. Certainly in Indian philosophies, it traces back farther than that. So it's not new, but it is a new idea insofar as it is a respectable scientific hypothesis. That's fairly new. And there were some sort of rumblings of it in the 1950s with Hugh Everett, and then in the 1980s with the idea of eternal inflation. And then everything came kind of roaring back in the early 2000s after the discovery of the cosmological constant, for reasons that we can either go into or not go into. But part of what got me really excited about it was that when I kind of stumbled on it, I thought, like, an infinite number of invisible worlds because they're constantly generated out of nothing and nowhere. That sounds a lot more like the stuff that I spend my time with, which is to say, mythologies and big stories and literature, and than it does physics. Where did this come from? And when I talked to my physicist colleagues and my astronomer colleagues, they kind of shook their head and they were like, "We don't know what the hell people are up. Like, what are they doing?" So my, effort was to understand. The big question was, how did an infinite number of infinite universes, each of which is entirely inaccessible to testing or observation, become a respectable scientific hypothesis? Like, how did that happen? What were the conditions?
Yeah, we wondered the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what I ended up arguing, at least in this most recent piece, was the answer to the question, is the multiverse a scientific hypothesis, can be answered in two ways, depending on what you mean by the multiverse, and depending on how the reasoner gets to this hypothesis. Somebody like Brian Greene will say, come on. I understand that the multiverse is like a big, fancy, untestable idea, but it's actually not totally untestable. It arises from scientific principles and orders of operation that themselves are testable. Observational astronomy, for example, and quantum field theory, for example. And so insofar as the as versions of the multiverse come out of these respectable ways of doing science, they should ultimately be testable by them. And so there are people out there who have Laura Mersini Houghton, for example, at the University of North Carolina, who's got this notion that universes are generated out of a sort of primordial multiversal bath. And she claims that that this theory can predict what kinds of remnants will be left on the cosmic microwave background, and then searches the cosmic microwave background for evidence of collisions with other worlds, of the birth of other worlds, et cetera. My sense is that insofar as you're doing that kind of science, insofar as you say there is some way of looking for evidence of this type, that it is at least that yes, you can absolutely say this is a scientific hypothesis. It can be tested. Now, will we ever prove it as a scientific theorem? Probably not. But I think that you can take it seriously as a scientific hypothesis if there are scientific means of pursuing an answer to the question that you are asking. Insofar as other theoretical physicists will say, look, man, we don't have any better answer to the question of why the universe is so finely tuned.
There's this guy, this astrophysicist from England called Bernard Carr, who actually made a statement saying, if you don't want God, you need the multiverse.
That's it. If you don't want God, you better have a multiverse. Yeah, exactly. The universe is so exquisitely tuned to allow planets and stars and eventually people and puppies and pencils and dogs to form that either there is some kind of cosmic mix master of a divinity back there, making sure we have just enough gravity and just enough weak nuclear force and just enough cosmological constant, right? Or it's just random luck, but random luck isn't really an answer. Or there are an infinite number of universes that try on all possible parameters throughout infinite time. And every once in a while, a universe comes out kind of okay, and that's our universe. So that it's the equivalent, the cosmic equivalent of having monkeys at typewriters. Eventually, if you have an infinite number of monkeys at an infinite number of typewriters, you'll eventually get Shakespeare. Our universe is Shakespeare. So right, the multiverse becomes an explanation that seems to some people better than God as an explanation. And
I just have to interject here as a philosopher. I'm sure you know this, but any classical theist of Aquinas type would immediately say that that's a terrible argument.
Of course it's a terrible argument.
I mean, God would still be required as the fundamental grounding of being, even in a multiverse scenario. So that way of thinking is just completely wrong.
Aquinas gets rid of this in Quaestio 1, the first question of the Summa, where he says, whatever natural processes you have to explain the origins of the world, my answer to you is God created those processes.
Exactly.
It's just so easily theologically dismissible. But it does seem to me that line of thinking is more theological than it is scientific. That it's a theological, now it's a bad theological answer, but it's natural theology. It's the same thing that folks were doing in the 18th century to try to come up with a natural explanation for the origins of the universe rather than a theological one. And frankly, it doesn't seem to me, even if it were respectable theology, which I don't think it is, it's not clear to me that an infinite number of invisible universes is any less of a metaphysical commitment than an infinite God. I just don't understand why you would prefer one or the other. So
yeah, I agree that it's right. It's you're still like, why would that be less problematic, especially if they're invisible and you will never be able to have any contact with them, and you're using it as an explanatory crutch to get over the problems in your theory.
I know.
Why is supernatural God actually worse than that? They're both invisible mysteries that'll never be solved.
At least you can talk to God. You can't talk to the universe.
Exactly. You can at least worship God,
I would
right?
argue philosophically, the idea of God in that classical theist sense is actually more philosophically rigorous than
Yeah.
the multiverse articulated that way, because
Well,
it's
people have
either-
argued that it's a simpler explanation.
exactly.
It's, you know,
Yeah,
if we're,
yeah.
And also, isn't this just the old problem of the first cause all over again? It turtles all the way down, because then you say, well, where's the multiverse coming from? And how come the laws of physics apply to that multiverse? And how is that selected? And so does the multiverse itself has an origin, or is it eternal?
Right.
And so you just can't get around this. And scientists, I think, it's okay to throw in the towel maybe in some kinds of questions in science. And I think that's really one of them, that the way we do science nowadays just cannot cover this kind of epistemic questions where you cannot go beyond the beginning of a narrative.
Yeah. You
Because
cannot
every
go beyond
story
the
starts somewhere.
Can I ask about that though? Actually, MJ, in this idea, sort of because to me, it's actually a failure. First of all, it's a failure of, once again, sort of oft-times popular physicists having no background in philosophy to see that they're making these ridiculous philosophical statements, which will then turn around and say, well, we hate philosophy. But more than that, it seems like a profound failure in terms of theorizing that, like, there may be entirely other ways of developing a theory of the universe, or of a cosmology that sort of doesn't require this. And maybe, that there are ways that it's actually in the narrative of your Big Bang cosmology that's where you're tripping up to be required for that. Is that also possible?
Great. I think it's totally possible. And this is the thing that I tend to look out for. I tend to look out for places that religion and philosophical commitments or metaphysical assumptions about the world are sneaking in to inform the natural sciences in ways that natural scientists themselves don't often understand. And I do think that, and as you probably remember, when Georges Lemaitre produced the sort of his formulation of the Big Bang hypothesis to Einstein, Einstein said, no, not that. That looks too much like creation. And when the CMB was discovered in the 1960s in Holmdel, New Jersey, next to my hometown of Middletown, New Jersey, immediately the Pope at the time issued this proclamation saying, "Oh my gosh, modern physics has confirmed what Christianity and Judaism have known all along, which is that God created the universe at a point in time out of nothing." I think that insofar as the big question of cosmology has been recently, where did it all come from? How do we get from nothing to something? What is the absolute origin point? We are stuck in monotheistic questions. Those are monotheistic questions. Where did it all come from the beginning? Anytime that I present any of this material to colleagues who have backgrounds in, Indian and Asian philosophies, they're like, what is the problem? Why are you so obsessed with finding a beginning to things, right? So maybe that the question is being informed by an assumption that there has to be an absolute beginning to things. But the idea that there has to be an absolute beginning to things comes out of old mythologies that are kind of baked into what we think is just sort of, I don't know, secular science. I don't know, Adam, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and this is interesting because I'm just reading the Avatamsaka Sutra right now with the Buddhaverse, the infinitely interpenetrating. It's mind-blowing. It's like hallucinogenic. So can you explain a little bit, from these other perspectives, how this doesn't even really arise, or in other traditions, other civilizational traditions, so to speak?
Yeah. So in we get in, for example, sort of classical Indian thought, the idea of kalpas, of eras of time that just flow from one another and follow from one another, and it's just kalpas all the way down, right? It's there's no need to find a beginning to things, because everything that is comes out of what has been, which frankly is. William James would say that kind of idea of the universe is much more in accordance with what we experience, right? We don't experience things coming out of nothing. We experience anything that's new as a product of all kinds of other stuff that came before it. So it just doesn't seem to be a problem for Indian philosophies. And then when we get into, Tibetan Buddhism, the story goes kind of what is in Indian philosophies primarily a kind of temporal, cyclical notion,
Yeah.
becomes kind of more, you could imagine it as more spatial in like the Tibetan universe, for example. Like there are just worlds all over the damn place. And yes, of course, they're temporal, but they're also spatial. They're just elsewhere. They're in other kind of dimensions of space and time, these Buddha worlds, these worlds of all kinds of beings. And that's just the way things go. But it's not positing these universes, and the way that the reason it's kind of hard to, the reason I didn't write a book about, the multiverse in world religions or something like that, is that there's not really a parity between the way that these worlds are posited in Western and non-Western philosophies. In Asian philosophies in particular, the reason you meditate on these Buddha worlds is not to, learn how to get your rockets going faster or something like that. It's in order to understand your place in the universe, and to attain to attain liberation. There's like a practice that goes along with it. There's a reason. There's like a strategic reason and a personal reason and a reason and a communal reason, to live into these cosmologies, which is very different from trying to determine the origin for the sake of having the absolute origin story. Right?
So there is a tension between, maybe the Western way of thinking about time as linear, so having a beginning, and in these other traditions where you have a more circular time. For example, in Hinduism, you have the Shiva creation myth, right, which is a rhythmic universe that is created and destroyed in time, infinitely many times to the past and infinitely many times to the future. And then there's no one point of creation that is more important than every other one. So they're all sort of there. And then India is amazing, because then you have the Jains, right, that say this story of creation is BS, that the universe is infinite, is uncreated, right? And then they have this whole argument about, if God created the universe, and this was written in the 8th century, I think, what was he doing before creation? And if you say that God created the universe because he wanted people to admire him, then God is vain, and then God is not perfect. And if God is not perfect, if he's imperfect, how could he have created a perfect universe? And goes on and on and on, sort of demolishing these. So there is a lot of tension in many of these different creation myths, right?
Yep.
But the vast majority is, God's doing the stuff, right?
God's doing this stuff. That's right. And it's not as though, Western philosophies are insulated from these conversations. I mean, there's a lot of interrelationship of these ideas, particularly in the, medieval and sort of late antique periods. So, I mean, this was a raging debate in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when folks were asking Augustine of Hippo what was God doing before God was created, and Augustine says God was preparing hell for people who ask questions like that, because Augustine understood that, like, that's where the questioning breaks down, right? That's where he can't go. That's the place. But Origen of Alexandria, faced with this problem, said God must create continual worlds, because God must have been God of something before the universe. We know that the universe was created in time. Therefore, God must have created an infinite number of worlds. He basically grabs Stoic cosmology, and says there must be worlds that emerge from worlds, for the sake of preserving the ever godliness of God. I don't know what you call that, like God's godliness. God has to be God forever. Therefore, Augustine does this kind of wonky thing with angels, where God says that, I keep calling Augustine God, which, that God's creation of the angels is eternal. Therefore, God is eternally God over something, which is to say the angels and the heavenly movements, and then temporal creation is created in time. But he knows it's a fudge, which is why he says this thing about preparing hell for people who ask questions.
Can we just expand a little, because this is something that has always struck me, that about the idea that much of the sort of constrictions, or what we call the blind spot, right? We have that whole book on the blind spot, was really, so much of it came because of, science in its current form emerged from the, Abrahamic tradition, the combination of the Greeks and the Abrahamic tradition. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of locked in a certain kind of attitude about experience
Yeah.
that alienated experience from scientific discourse. So one thing I'm struck by is like in the Scholium, when Newton is trying to ground absolute space and time, he sort of relies on God. He's like, oh well, absolute space is God's perspective. It's literally the God's eye view.
Mm-hmm.
And that if science had originated, if this version of science had originated in India, or somewhere in Asia, some of these problems wouldn't even have, it seemed to me, some of these problems that we just roll over again and again wouldn't even have occurred.
Yeah, I think this is right. And again, there are people throughout the Western tradition who keep trying to kind of turn it around. So you have Spinoza, for example, who says, look, what we mean by God is nature itself, not some punctum outside the universe. I mean the universe itself, I mean nature itself. And by nature, I mean an infinitely perspectival set of positions. And I call one position extension, and I call another position mind or idea. But there are others, I just don't know what they are. Like the two that appear to us are mind and matter. And then there are an infinite number of other. But of course, Spinoza gets discounted as being an Oriental philosopher, right? That's just like too Asian sounding. He gets coded as a heretic. His heresy becomes known as pantheism. Pantheism becomes a thing that nobody's allowed to talk about. The German Romantics come in. They get squashed. There are all kinds of moments that the tradition, the Western tradition, such as it is, tries to kind of correct itself and remove this blind spot, or at least improve it, ameliorate it in some kind of way. And it never seems to stick. It never seems to stick. This sort of linearity and the notion of an absolute beginning and the notion of an absolute time and space and the notion of observer independent. I mean, it doesn't even. Where did the multiple worlds hypothesis, the many worlds hypothesis come from? It's so, the minute quantum physics gets to the point where it says, it seems like everything is only knowable from the particular perspective that you're setting up, right? It seems like the answer you get is contingent upon the question you ask. Suddenly we get the many worlds hypothesis, which finds a way to salvage a kind of absolute perspective from which all things emerge smoothly, because somehow collectively we want it so badly. We want it so badly.
Actually, that's a great question. Who wants it, right? That's a really, if we look at the sociology of science,
right.
Like, who wants that so badly that it keeps getting jammed back down our throats?
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure the answer to that, but it's like with the many worlds interpretation. I mean, what's remarkable about it is it's still, it'll, if you do a vote, most physicists who work in quantum interpretations will choose the many worlds interpretation. And now you have cubism, which is really pushing back hard about that. And, people will argue, that, it's solipsism. It's like, no, it's clearly not. But, that you see, look at the pushback against it. And you can see sort of like, what is it? What's the investment here that at all possible costs, we cannot allow, the process of science to admit the role of experience?
I think that there is a sociological undercurrent here, which is and I was thinking about this the other day. The problem with this quantum mechanics thing and trying to find this ontological way of justifying a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end is that quantum mechanics does not have a middle. It has a beginning, the initial condition, and it has the observation at the end.
Right.
We don't know how you go from point A to point B. You just know that there is point A, and the point B is the observation. And there's this whole narrative in between missing, which is the story we've been telling ourselves, that there has to be time evolving, and then it does this, and the electron goes through which slit does the electron go, this way or that way? It's like this need to have this kind of in-between.
How is it interfering with itself? How is it?
Yeah. And I would even, like, just because I've been itching to say this, I actually think that this the whole fine-tuning problem is a massive red herring. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
And nobody says it. Nobody says it. There is no fine-tuning problem. There can't be, in relation to what?
Exactly.
We have nothing in relation to which to say that it's surprising. Yes.
We
Can
try.
you guys unpack that a little bit more? Because sometimes I get
Sure.
caught by the fine-tuning problem. I'm like, wait a minute, all these constants are so perfect. So please tell me.
Because if you go and you look at the way science actually is constructed, right? I mean, how you do this. I mean, let's take specific examples. When Newton started his theory of gravity, he didn't know the value of the gravitational constant. There was something missing there because he needed the dimensions on one side of the equation and the other side of the equation to match, and also the strength of the interaction, right? And so some guy, masculine or somebody, measured the Newton's constant some time ago, and then Cavendish did it too afterwards, right? And then that was known as the value. And then you go and you look at the same path for every fundamental constant of nature. Planck's constant, same thing. He came up with a theory of the black body, and then he wanted to match the curve to the experimental curve. There was a mismatch of left side and right side, so he puts in the constant there so that the curves match. That is how the constants of nature emerge in practice. And so it is really coming from the process of measurement and discovery in that way, the so-called workshop that we talk about in the book. And so to come back and now say, but there has to be a reason why these constants have the values that they do, that is not part of the narrative. That is a part of the Abrahamic narrative, that there has to be a reason from the beginning for these things be the way they are.
Can we just actually, Marcia, I was just thinking we should probably tell our listeners, because some of our listeners know, what is the fine-tuning problem? We should probably, some people may not know, so let's define that.
So the fine-tuning problem is that the way we do physics, there are fundamental numbers that we use, which call constants of nature, like the speed of light, the strength of the gravitational attraction, the mass of the electron, the mass of the quarks. There are a list of about 20-something in the standard model of particle physics of these numbers, which are measured quantities in the laboratory, right? And if you tweak with those values, if you change the value of the gravitational force by a little bit, or if you change the mass of the electron, then you don't make stars. And then if you don't make stars, you can have planets, and you can have people, you can have us, you can have life. So the idea is that those values must have been adjusted or are such that allow us observers to be in the universe. That's called the weak entropic principle. So the fine-tuning problem is, how is that possible? How come the electron has this mass? How come gravity has that value? How come the quarks have those masses? And to me, the answer is because we measure them to be that. There is no fundamental reason for that to be the case. That is exactly how we measure things to be. Why is the temperature of the sun, 57 degrees, on the surface? Because we measure that to be, as a star that does this. And so the why question that comes with this fine-tuning problem bothers me tremendously, because it creates this whole big 10-headed monster, like now we have to explain why the values of the constants of nature are like this. And I say this, being a guy who did my PhD thesis exactly on this thing. String theory will explain all constants of nature. This is really cool, because all constants of nature but one, which is the string tension, and is the first cause again. You cannot get around that thing, So to me, it's all a very convoluted fabrication, and the idea that science has to explain everything, this kind of scientism, that all answers that we ask about the world can be answered by this way we do science.
Speaking as a philosopher, I would say it's one thing to say it's not a scientific question, which seems right. It's another thing to say there's not a question of any kind there at all. And I think so this is a confusion that often comes up, is people think that the philosophical question that science answers is, why is there something rather than nothing, where the answer would be a temporal beginning. But giving a temporal beginning to the question of why there is something rather than nothing is not the right form of answer for that question. The question is a metaphysical, philosophical one, which you can raise. And again, classical theists like Aquinas knew this, or even more recent philosophers like Heidegger, if you want to go into phenomenology, is that the question is, why is being in each moment that we can either experience or that we can specify, why is there something that's manifest or disclosed in that moment. And pointing to an antecedent moment, you can continue pointing back, but a first time won't give you an answer to why things are sustained in their being in each moment. That's, Aquinas, for example, already said, you could have an infinite regress of causes, you could have an infinite regress in time, but that doesn't ground why things are as they are here and now. So the question of being, so it's like the constant question seems to me to confuse those two things. It's like there's no scientific answer, perhaps, to the question of why the constants are what they are. But the question of being, why is there something rather than nothing in the way that it's disclosed to us? That's still a question, I think. It's just not a scientific question that you answer in terms of modeling, measurement, observation. I mean, that's our argument in the blind spot anyway.
But the funny thing is okay, and how would you deal with that question? And lots of religions say, well, there was an absolute power that solved the problem for me. And the question that I have sometimes is, why just not need to have an answer to that question? Why can't you just live with the mystery that you just don't know, period? MJ, you wrote this, I think, was that your first book, Strange Wonder, which is kind of about this a little bit, right? In which you tried to figure something, you actually was about Heidegger and this notion of being. Mm-hmm. Is there any kind of light that comes from there at all, backing up what Evan is saying?
Yeah, this was really interesting, Evan, to hear you go to Heidegger for this. I do think that physics becomes metaphysics when it gets from the what of the fundamental constants to the why of the fundamental constants. Like that just tends to be the moment when physics tumbles into metaphysics without necessarily knowing. And then it starts spinning out explanations that, because it came from physical questions, seem to be physical answers, but they're actually metaphysical answers, right?
Exactly.
And I do think that while why is there something rather than nothing is certainly a worthwhile metaphysical question. How come the fine tunings are so surprising is not a great or well-formulated question, because they're not surprising in relation to anything else. We have an N of one. We don't have anything into relation to which they may be. So there are better and worse ways to formulate the question. But either way, I do think that you're on metaphysical terrain at that point. And it would at the very least make sense to admit that that's where you are, and that we're asking that the answers that we then come up with are going to be of a different order from the questions that got us there in the first place. As far as Heidegger goes, the thing that got me into this wonder business a million years ago was that I had heard a faculty member say that, well, for Plato, wonder is the origin of all philosophy. She just sort of said this in a passing way, and I thought, wow, that really. I had never heard it before. I was in grad school. I just never, and I don't even know what happened for the rest of the class, because I started thinking, but isn't it the work of philosophy to do everything it can to avoid wonder, right? Like, isn't philosophy actually trying as hard as it can to shut wonder down?
It shouldn't be.
That became the argument of the book, that that it seems that in this Abrahamic Grecian tradition that many of us find ourselves working in, there are actually two different strands of investigation, and that this ends up mapping onto the way that I think that the natural sciences work too. There's the kind of philosophical and natural scientific investigation that kind of instrumentalizes wonder, right? Like, you're curious about something and then you figure out the answer, and then you're curious about the next thing and you figure out the answer. This is the way that Aristotle suggested that we behave in relation to wonder. Wonder is there. It serves a functional equivalent, a functional purpose for him. It's there to make us uncomfortable so that we can become more comfortable about when we get an answer, and then we're uncomfortable again. But the whole point of following the lead of wonder for Aristotle is eventually to not to wonder anymore, to be done with it. This is a Cartesian way of proceeding. Descartes actually says in one of his treatises on the passions that astonishment, he says, is an excess of wonder which can never be anything but bad. And the reason is that it shuts
bummer.
I know. He's I don't think he was like a party animal, that dude.
I think he must have died a virgin. I don't know much about Descartes' love story, but seriously.
Yeah, there's that bit in Nietzsche about how philosophers who get married are really just joking, because philosophy can't possibly be passionate. But then there's this other strand. I know it's awful. There's this. He says Socrates got married, but that was just a joke. There's this other strand of philosophy and of natural science that works by sort of moving from wonder to greater wonder. This is the way I understand, Marcelo, your book on the island of knowledge, which the idea is that the more you discover, the more you realize how much more there is to discover. And it actually opens larger and larger mysteries, not for the sake of leaving you in, dumbfounded astonishment, but for the sake of producing a kind of learned ignorance, right? Like a learned, a knowledgeable unknowing. And this is certainly the way that it seems to me. This is my reading of Plato. My sense is that the Platonic dialogues are encouraging us in that kind of direction.
Absolutely.
And that there's a kind of strand that then, and you can put you can put Augustine in that camp. You can put Aquinas in the other camp. One kind of Aquinas. If you can put the sort of New Age hippy dippy Aquinas in the other one. And that these two strands kind of interact with one another, some usually agonistically throughout the long unfolding of Western philosophy and science. So I guess that and it was my postulation in that book that it's really Heidegger who sort of demands that philosophy reopen itself to the sort of primordial unknowing that gets it going in the first place and dwell in it rather than trying to shut it down.
Quash it down.
Yeah.
One interesting thing along these lines is that I discovered in my first book, which was on science and religion, by going through sort of the corpus of religious studies, was Rudolf Otto and his articulation of what things are religious, what feelings, what experiences, because always it goes back to experience, and his identification of awe, the experience of awe as being a fundamentally spiritual or religious experience. And what's funny is you'll find so many sort of hardcore atheist, physicist, scientists talking about awe. They'll be like, well, anything about spirituality is stupid, but, science leads us to awe. And I always thought that was so interesting, because what they're missing is the fact that awe, fundamentally, that wonder, that joy in wonder of standing before the cloud of unknowing is a fundamentally spiritual response to the world. And so, more awe in that sense can be part of science, should be part of science.
Right. And the thing that I think that Heidegger gets right about awe, which this is in his later works, is that there are two sides to awe, which Otto knows. There's, the sort of ravished amazement, and there's also the terror at the same time. And that any wonder worth its salt is going to combine both of these experiences, the experience of sort of amazement and the experience of horror. And
I never got the horror. Can you? I never like the horror part.
It's a bad trip.
It's huge, but like horror, like cosmic. Well, who's the horror writer who always has the cosmic horror? I never,
You weren't into that, yeah. I mean, and you can see it hitting different people. Some people don't like the horror. I'm hoping to present a paper later in the spring about the way that Einstein runs away from the horror part of awe. But so you find this term in all of the ancient languages. The Psalms have yirah, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that yirah is really this sort of amazed terror. I was once in a yoga class, and the teacher had us all meditating, and we were really deep into this meditation, and he was like, "And now imagine that you are face to face with God." And I was like, like, what? Who wants to be faced? Like, what kind of God have you got? Like, this is terrifying, right? There's in a biblical tradition, right? The amazement one feels before God is also a sort of a terror of one's own inadequacy and one's own smallness.
Job.
Yeah, and also in both, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and also in Hinduism, say in the Bhagavad Gita, you can't see God and live. It's impossible. It's overwhelming, terrifying. It obliterates the finite, limited sense of self. So, that is utterly terrifying to try to have that experience in an incarnate form, according to those traditions, no, you explode.
There's a great scene in the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna,
Exactly, that's
asks
right.
Krishna, like, reveal yourself.
Yeah.
And he does, and he's like,
Yeah, no, go back to being human.
Bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah. I
Is
wanted
that
to
why-
just, connect back to the wonder thing, just to say another 20th century philosopher besides Heidegger, I think, who's really important in this discussion is Gabriel Marcel, who makes this distinction between problems and mysteries. So problems is the kind of, you might start out with curiosity and wonder, but it's the idea that, there's a solution, you have a technique, you have a method, and then eventually, you solve the problem. But mysteries aren't like that. Mysteries are questions you can't separate yourself from, that your whole being is entangled with, that don't have answers in that way, that just keep opening up and disclosing, more and more vistas. And he chooses the word mystery because he's thinking of the traditions of mysticism that go back to Plato, Plato, Plotinus, John Scotus Erigena, this tradition of Neoplatonic mysticism. And that's extremely deep in science. But going back to the question of, why does science always choose not to go down that path? That's always there in the history of science, deeply resurfacing in Romanticism. But for some reasons that are probably complicated, psychologically and sociologically, science seems to choose the other way, probably because of the incredible instrumental power that comes from, manipulating the world in this extractive way that has given us the climate crisis, right? So all of these other traditions, that too, of course, all of these other traditions have, very different sort of reverential relationship to nature and mystery. The mystical traditions,
the mystical traditions. And talking about that, another book that Mary-Jane wrote is about pantheism and why it was considered monstrous by organized religion, and you mentioned Spinoza as one of the examples, right? And I think that's related to awe as well, right? Awe is not being horrible, but awe is being the enchantment of being in a world which is, I don't know, the presence of God. I don't know how to say it.
That book was, that actually came out of the end of the Multiverse book, where I began to suggest that those physicists who have embraced wholeheartedly the multiverse as an explanatory principle for the sake of not embracing God as an explanatory principle, think that they're atheists, right? They think that they're saying, I don't want God. Exactly. But it's not atheistic, it's pantheistic. It's the idea is that the origin, source, creative principle, sustaining principle of the universe is internal to the universe, and that's what the West calls pantheism. So insofar as they're already on theological ground because they're asking this why question, the kind of theism that encompasses this position is a pantheism. So I was trying to look at the way that pantheisms kind of show up in the contemporary sciences, and found that it's really hard to map that, because there's no decent history of pantheism, because the minute you call somebody a pantheist, they think that you're calling them a bad name or something like that. But certainly the kind of positions that here, this is how I'm going to connect it. If pantheism, what pantheism is in its most broad scope is an affirmation of the universe as what we tend to call God, right? That's what the universe itself is the source of its own being. The universe is sort of auto and sympoetically creative. The universe creates itself, sustains itself, destroys itself periodically for the sake of some kind of renewal. That's the pantheistic position. And when theists, classical theists, people who affirm the existence of a God outside the universe, encounter this position, they say, like, how dare you divinize cancer? How dare you divinize hurricanes? How dare you divinize suffering? And what I think the pantheistic position understands is that there's nothing necessarily good in our anthropocentric way of understanding goodness about the source of everything that is, that it is wonderful, it is beautiful, it is also terrible and terrifying. And you would need to affirm that duplicity of the mystery, for example, right, to use that term from Marcel, in order to affirm a pantheistic viewpoint. You get to divorce yourself from it if you posit a divinity outside the world and say he's entirely good and the world is the source of the evil. You don't get that escape hatch from a more pantheistic perspective.
Wow, it sounds like a big confusion because, at least to me, good and evil is a human problem, not a nature problem. Is that
Right.
we made that stuff up. Nature is nature,
Nature is
right?
nature.
And I know you have to go soon. So, but I wanted to connect just with your most recent, well, one of the most, I think is the Astrotopia book. Just talking a little bit because Adam is going to love this, So it's really about the modern space race, punted by billionaires, and what does have to do with religion, in a very kind of like interesting way. If you could just summarize it.
Yeah. Okay.
Because we could have you back actually to
Exactly.
Would
Yeah,
love
we
to
should
come
do that.
back. But here's
should do that.
the preview. There are two big ways that I think religion shows up in space exploration. One more historical, to justify the conquest of the stars of outer space as a natural extension of the same story that colonized the Americas. So the idea is, just as God called Europeans across the seas to the Americas to conquer that territory, and then just as God called light-skinned European descended Americans from the East Coast all the way to California in the period known as guided by so-called manifest destiny. Right, it's the destiny that manifests, the clear destiny of European descended humans to take over the entire continent. So now is God calling the U.S. Up into the stars. This is what Werner von Braun, the Nazi convert to U.S. imperialism, asserted in the 1950s. This is what the current sitting president of the United States has said numerous times. It is America's manifest destiny to conquer the solar system and eventually to live on Mars and then beyond. So there's a long religious narrative that really begins in the promised land and the exodus of God's chosen people from slavery into Canaan, that's then revitalized in the trek across the seas, and then that's sort of analogized in the trek into the stars. That's one thing. But Mike Pence will say, for example, Psalm 139 says that God will always be with us when we go into the heavens. And Donald Trump will say it's America's manifest destiny to go into the. It's my sense that these references don't hit that hard anymore. None of my students is stirred by manifest destiny. None of my students is stirred by the hand of God, for honestly. The way that religion is really taking shape in this discourse in a new way now is that there are a number of, as you know, very wealthy men who have appointed themselves not just technological leaders, but actually saviors of the species, of consciousness itself, of the earth, and who I think are kind of self-appointed messiahs who generate these movements around them, so that if you criticize the space industry, the burgeoning space industry, as polluting the Earth, as polluting low Earth orbit, as being potentially very damaging to the moon or to Mars or both, as exporting an extractive paradigm to asteroids, et cetera, you become accused of hating humanity. Because after all, humanity's salvation lies in its capacity to colonize Mars. And that's the only way through. So either you're with us with this sort of eternal salvation in another world, which sounds eerily like eternal salvation is promised in other worlds, or you hate humanity. But so it's the discourse sort of hops up into this ideological level very, very quickly from what it actually is, which is an economic and military escapade in outer space. So those are the two ways that I think religion is functioning here.
Well, there's so much to unpack. It's pretty wild. But
so let's do this. Yeah, do this.
Yeah,
again.
we should have another episode on that, definitely.
Because I love space. I'm a super space nerd, so I would really. But I totally get Elon Musk.
I love space too. I think that, but if we're doing it, we should send other folks to lead the way.
Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want him in charge of my air. My monthly air allotment.
Of my air, I know.
Right. Oh boy. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. This was awesome.
Marcelo, Evan, and Adam, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
So much fun.
Thank you. Fantastic.